Vikings didn't just forge axes, they summoned them from the swamp. Each blade began in a cold bog where blacksmiths hauled iron sludge that reeked of sulfur. It took 30,000 hammer strikes and days of fire-hot fury to transform that muck into a weapon that could crush shields. Let's forge it together. That's bog iron, Viking's secret ingredient. One blacksmith crew could haul out up to 500 kilos in a week, their hands raw from scraping muck with wooden rakes. Bog iron formed when iron-rich groundwater oozed up, mixing with oxygen to create iron bacteria slime. Sounds gross. It was. But that slime slowly hardened into iron nodules. Once yanked out, the nodules were smashed apart with hammers to break off clay pockets. Skip that step, and when you fired your furnace, the trapped water would explode, spraying molten sludge across the workshop. But drying iron lumps was the easy part. Next, they had to build a furnace that could burn hotter than 1,200 degrees Celsius, 2,190 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to liquefy stone. And that's where most amateurs failed. Stick around, because firing that furnace was where the real danger and the real skill began. Imagine kneeling in a damp clearing, your hands buried in cold clay. You're not making pottery. You're about to build a furnace that can hit 2,300 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,260 degrees Celsius, hot enough to liquefy iron ore into a glowing river. But first, you have to shape it by hand. No blueprints, no factory molds, just skill and guesswork. Viking blacksmiths mixed river clay, crushed shells, and straw to prevent cracking. Even then, about 40% of furnaces collapsed during the first firing. They shaped the furnace into a short cylinder about 3 feet tall with a narrow throat. This design trapped heat and let oxygen blast through. The Vikings had no thermometers, so they judged temperature by color. Bright yellow meant perfect heat. Dull red meant you were wasting charcoal. To boost airflow, they carved a tuyere hole, basically a mouth, in the side of the furnace. That's where the bellows connected. It's also the spot where a single spark could shoot out and torch your tunic. During excavation in Denmark, archaeologists found scorched tunic scraps near these furnaces, proof that sometimes the work literally lit you on fire. But that was the risk. No heat, no iron, no axe. But how do you turn a pile of iron sludge into something you can actually forge? That's what we'll uncover next. Once the clay furnace dried, it was time to load it with bog iron ore, charcoal, and blind hope. You'd shovel in alternating layers, 40 pounds of ore, then 40 pounds of charcoal. The fuel burned hotter than any campfire you've ever seen. But here's the kicker. Keeping the temperature above 2,200 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,200 degrees Celsius, meant pumping the bellows nonstop for 6 to 8 hours. No breaks, no sitting down. If you paused, the iron cooled and turned into useless slag. In one experiment, researchers calculated it took 18,000-foot pumps on the bellows to complete a single smelt. When the smelt worked, though, you'd see something miraculous: a bloom, a spongy mass of pure iron glowing bright orange, weighing about 25 pounds. To get it out, you'd break the furnace wall with a wooden mallet. One mishit, and you'd drop your bloom straight into the dirt. Imagine ruining an entire week's work because your hands slipped. And this was only the halfway point. You still had to beat that raw bloom into shape fast before it cooled into something too hard to forge. But how did they turn that ugly lump into a weapon that could split a man's skull? Let's fire up the forge. Pulling a 25-pound iron bloom out of the furnace was like catching a burning meteor with your bare hands, except you had seconds to act. If you waited too long, the bloom cooled into a brick, harder than regret. So the blacksmiths slammed it onto an anvil, a huge stone or iron block, and started hammering like their lives depended on it, because they sort of did. Every blow forced out slag, those glassy impurities that made iron brittle. If you left too much inside, the axe would shatter the first time it hit a shield. Some days, you'd spend 4 straight hours hammering that bloom. Each strike needed to be precise. Too soft, and the slag stayed hidden. Too hard, and you cracked the bloom in half, sending weeks of labor to hell. Vikings used sledgehammers weighing 10 pounds, swung in rhythm. Archaeologists found ancient forge pits, stained black from iron scales, tiny flakes that flew off with every hit. Here's a detail most documentaries skip. The noise was deafening. Some smiths stuffed sheep's wool in their ears to keep from going half-deaf by 30. And even when the bloom was finally solid, it didn't look like a blade. It looked like a lumpy ingot. But buried inside was potential, like a sculptor seeing a statue inside a block of marble. But you might be wondering, how did they shape it into a razor-sharp edge without modern grinders? The next step was where finesse met brute force. Imagine taking that lumpy iron ingot and flattening it into an axe head by hand while it's still glowing orange. That's what Viking smiths faced next. They reheated the bloom until it reached 2,000 degrees Fahrenheit, 1,090 degrees Celsius, then gripped it with giant tongs and slammed it over and over. Each hammer strike stretched the iron outward, thinning it into a rough blade. The trick was to keep the metal hot enough to be pliable, but not so hot it burned. If you saw sparks shooting like fireworks, you were oxidizing your future axe into useless flakes. Viking axe blades weren't just lumps of iron. The edges needed to be hard enough to cut bone while the body stayed tough and shock-absorbing. So smiths folded the blade over itself, welding layers together with silica-rich flux, an ancient flux that worked like sticky glass, binding metal into a single piece. But here's the part nobody romanticizes. Sometimes the weld failed completely. One wrong tap with the hammer, and your carefully folded blade split open like a cracked biscuit. That meant reheating, re-welding, and praying to Thor you didn't ruin the temper. And every second the iron cooled was another second you lost control. The metal hardened fast, and by the time you blinked, you were beating cold steel, useless and brittle. But even when the shape was perfect, it was still far from ready. Next came the ritual that separated a tool from a weapon. Once the axe blade looked right, it wasn't even close to finished. The iron was still soft, more like warm clay than steel, so blacksmiths had to harden it, and this step was a gamble every time. They reheated the blade again, this time aiming for a cherry red glow around 1,500 degrees Fahrenheit, 815 degrees Celsius. You couldn't use a thermometer, so you judged by color. Too cool, and the edge would be dull forever. Too hot, and the blade warped or cracked. When the temperature was perfect, they yanked it from the coals and plunged it into a vat of animal fat or stale urine. Yes, really. Quenching wasn't just dramatic, it was essential. The sudden cooling realigned the iron crystals into martensite, a microstructure harder than anything the Vikings had seen. But quenching also brought a risk: thermal shock. The blade could snap in half with a gunshot crack. Some smiths held their breath because after 30 hours of work, the whole thing could die in seconds. There's a story in old sagas of a smith who lost 3 blades in one day and finally threw his hammer across the forge, swearing never to touch iron again. If you heard a ping echo through the workshop, you knew the blade had split. That sound haunted blacksmiths worse than any war drum. And even if it survived, it still needed sharpening, polishing, and something every Viking prized. A personal mark proving it was worthy of carrying into battle. If the quenching worked, the blade was harder than bone, but it was rough, covered in black scale and brittle burrs. So the next job was sharpening, and this took almost as long as forging. Blacksmiths used whetstones soaked in water or goat fat to grind the edge smooth. Some stones were imported, huge blocks of Norwegian schist so fine they felt like silk under your thumb. A good edge needed hours of patient work, moving the blade in slow arcs. They shaped it to a thin, lethal taper, sharp enough to slice a sheepskin cloak in midair, but an edge too thin risked chipping in combat. So they often left a micro bevel, an angle barely visible that made the axe last longer. And this wasn't just about performance. Vikings believed an unfinished blade brought bad luck. A dull weapon could fail you in battle, or worse, embarrass you in front of your clan. That's why every blacksmith added a maker's mark, a rune or a chiseled line near the eye of the axe. It was a signature and a warning. If the blade failed, everyone knew whose hands had made it. There's an old line from the sagas: the axe remembers the hand that forged it. If you messed up, your reputation was toast. But when you got it right, you held something terrifying, an edge honed by sweat, fire, and just enough fear to make you respect it forever. And yet, the axe still needed one more transformation before it could be called complete. No matter how perfect the blade was, it was worthless without a handle that could survive a war. Viking smiths called this the helve, and it had to be fitted by hand. They chose ash wood for good reason. Ash fibers are long and flexible, so the handle could absorb shock without splitting. A single branch, seasoned for over a year, was carved into a taper that wedged tight into the axe's eye. The fit wasn't gentle. Blacksmiths pounded the handle in with a wooden mallet, sometimes cursing the stubborn grain. A loose fit, the head would fly off mid-swing. Too tight, the eye might crack. Some handles were bound with rawhide strips, soaked in water so they shrank and locked everything solid. Others were wrapped in iron rings, hammered cold. A well-mounted axe could survive thousands of blows before loosening. Here's the risk nobody talks about. If the grain ran the wrong way, The handle could snap on the first hit. That meant weeks of work gone. More than one smith was known to burn the failed handle in shame before starting over. Handles were also shaped to curve slightly forward. That subtle bend wasn't decoration. It let the axe bite deeper with less effort, like a wooden lever designed for killing. Every part of this step was a quiet gamble, but when it held together, you finally had something real. A weapon that could outlive its maker. Ready to see what else Vikings built in ways that defy belief? Stick around, because in the next video, we'll watch them craft a ship in 10 hours, and you won't believe the tricks they used to outrun entire navies.